Sarah Martinez walked through the hospital corridors with her head held high, even though she could feel the stares burning into her back. The whispers followed her everywhere she went. Her colleagues would stop talking when she approached, and she could see them glancing at her right wrist where a small, intricate tattoo was visible beneath her rolled-up sleeves. The tattoo was unusual, that much was true. It wasn't like the typical designs most people chose. Instead, it was a series of interconnected symbols that looked almost military in nature, with sharp lines and geometric patterns that seemed to tell a story only she understood. The design wrapped around her wrist like a bracelet, dark ink against her olive skin. "There goes the wannabe soldier," she heard someone whisper as she passed the nurse's station. Sarah pretended not to hear, but her jaw tightened slightly. She'd been working at Metropolitan General Hospital for 3 months now, and the comments about her tattoo had only gotten worse. Dr. Patricia Wells, the head of the emergency department, had been particularly vocal about her disapproval. "Unprofessional," she would mutter whenever Sarah was assigned to her cases. What kind of medical professional gets military tattoos when they've never even served? The assumption stung because it was so far from the truth. Sarah had tried to explain once early in her employment, but her words had been dismissed. Now she simply focused on her work, letting her skills speak louder than the judgment of others. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, picking at her sandwich while reviewing patient charts. The cafeteria was buzzing with conversation, but the noise seemed to fade around her table. She had grown used to eating alone, even though she had been friendly and outgoing at her previous job. "Mind if I sit here?" asked Dr. James Chen, one of the newer residents. Sarah looked up, surprised. Most people avoided her table. "Sure," she replied, grateful for the company. James settled into the chair across from her and unwrapped his sandwich. "I've been meaning to ask you about your tattoo," he said, his voice curious rather than judgmental. "The design is really intricate." "Does it have special meaning?" Sarah's hand instinctively moved to cover her wrist. "It's complicated," she said softly. "I bet it is," James replied with a kind smile. "The best tattoos usually are." For a moment, Sarah considered telling him the truth. About the night she had gotten the tattoo, about what it really meant, about the man who had given her the design. But then she saw Dr. Wells approaching their table, her expression stern. "Miss Martinez," Dr. Wells said sharply, "I need you to cover that tattoo. We've had complaints from patients about it being distracting." Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment. "I understand," she replied quietly, pulling down her sleeve to cover the design completely. "Good," Dr. Wells said with satisfaction. "And in the future, perhaps consider the message you're sending with such choices." As Dr. Wells walked away, James shook his head in frustration. "That was completely unfair," he said. Sarah shrugged, trying to appear unaffected. "It's fine. I'm used to it, but it wasn't fine." Each comment, each stare, each whispered conversation chipped away at her confidence. She had moved to this city for a fresh start, hoping to build a new life where her past wouldn't follow her. Instead, she found herself defending choices that others couldn't possibly understand. That evening, as Sarah walked to her car after her shift, she noticed a black sedan parked near the hospital entrance. The windows were tinted, and something about it made her uneasy. She had seen similar cars before in another life, but she pushed the thought away. She was being paranoid. As she drove home to her small apartment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed new life was about to change. The tattoo on her wrist seemed to pulse with warmth, as if responding to some unspoken threat. She had no idea that tomorrow would bring a visitor who would turn her world upside down, and finally reveal the truth about the mark she carried. The next morning arrived with an unusual commotion at Metropolitan General Hospital. Sarah noticed the increased security presence as soon as she walked through the main entrance. Guards in dark suits stood at strategic positions, their eyes constantly scanning the crowds of patients and staff moving through the lobby. "What's going on?" Sarah asked the receptionist at the front desk. "Some important military official is being treated here," the woman replied in a hushed tone. "Very hush-hush. They've cleared out the entire VIP wing." Sarah felt a familiar chill run down her spine. Military officials meant questions she wasn't prepared to answer, connections she had tried desperately to sever. She made her way to the emergency department, hoping to lose herself in the familiar routine of patient care. Dr. Wells was already there, barking orders at the nursing staff with more intensity than usual. "I want everything perfect today," she announced to the gathered team. "We have very important visitors, and this hospital's reputation depends on providing exceptional care." The morning passed in a blur of routine cases until around noon, when Sarah noticed an unusual amount of activity in the hospital's executive corridor. Men in military uniforms moved with purpose through the halls, their presence commanding respect and attention from everyone they passed. Sarah was updating a patient chart when she heard Dr. Wells speaking to someone in the hallway just outside the emergency department. The conversation seemed heated, though she couldn't make out the specific words. Curiosity got the better of her, and she moved closer to the doorway. "I assure you, General Morrison, all our staff have been thoroughly vetted," Dr. Wells was saying, her voice tight with stress. "There are no security concerns with any of our personnel." "I'm not questioning your vetting process, Doctor," came a deep, authoritative voice that made Sarah's blood freeze. "But I need to speak with every staff member who will have access to this floor. It's standard protocol." Sarah's hands began to shake. "General Morrison?" The name hit her like a physical blow, bringing back memories she had spent years trying to suppress. She backed away from the doorway, her heart racing, but it was too late. "Miss Martinez," Dr. Wells called out sharply. "Come here, please. The general needs to speak with all department heads and senior staff." There was no escape. Sarah forced herself to walk forward, keeping her head down and her sleeves pulled securely over her wrists. Maybe he wouldn't recognize her. It had been 5 years, after all. People changed. "General Morrison," Dr. Wells said with exaggerated respect, "this is Sarah Martinez, one of our emergency department nurses." Sarah raised her eyes slowly, and her worst fears were confirmed. General Morrison stood before her in full dress uniform, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture rigid with military bearing. His pale blue eyes met hers, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The general's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated recognition. He extended his hand formally. "Miss Martinez," he said in his commanding voice. "A pleasure to meet you." Sarah shook his hand briefly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "General," she replied with a small nod. "The general is here because his son was involved in a training accident," Dr. Wells explained, clearly trying to impress their distinguished visitor. "Lieutenant Morrison is in stable condition, but the general wanted to personally oversee his care." "I see," Sarah managed to say, though her mouth felt dry as desert sand. General Morrison's gaze remained fixed on her face. "Tell me, Miss Martinez, have you worked in military hospitals before? You seem familiar with protocol." The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Dr. Wells looked between them, clearly sensing an undercurrent she didn't understand. Several other staff members had gathered nearby, drawn by the presence of such a high-ranking military officer. "No, sir," Sarah replied carefully. "I've only worked in civilian facilities." "Interesting," the general said, his tone giving nothing away. "Well, I'm sure you'll provide excellent care for any of our personnel who might need assistance." As he turned to leave with Dr. Wells, Sarah thought she might have escaped the encounter unscathed. But then the general paused and looked back at her. "Miss Martinez," he said, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear, "I notice you keep your sleeves pulled down. Are you cold? The hospital does tend to run a bit chilly." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm fine, thank you, General." "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable with them rolled up? It can get quite warm working in an emergency department." The suggestion was delivered with the tone of a man accustomed to having his recommendations followed. Sarah glanced around at the curious faces surrounding them. Dr. Wells looked expectant, clearly not wanting to displease their important visitor. "I'm comfortable as I am," Sarah said quietly. General Morrison nodded slowly, but his eyes held a look that Sarah remembered all too well. It was the expression he wore when he was planning his next move in a strategic game that others didn't even know they were playing. "Of course," he said with a slight smile. "Comfort is important. We'll speak again soon, Miss Martinez." As the general and his entourage moved down the hallway, Sarah remained frozen in place. The casual threat in his words was unmistakable to her, even if everyone else had missed it. He knew exactly who she was, and he had no intention of letting her fade quietly into civilian life. Dr. Wells turned back to the group, her face flushed with excitement. "Well, that was quite an honor," she said. "The general seems like a very observant man." Sarah nodded numbly and returned to her duties, but her hands continued to shake for the rest of her shift. The past she had tried so hard to escape had just walked back into her life in the form of the one man who could destroy everything she had built. For the rest of the week, Sarah lived in a state of constant anxiety. Every time she turned a corner in the hospital, she expected to see General Morrison waiting for her. The black sedan she had noticed continued to appear in different locations around the hospital parking lot, confirming her suspicions that she was being watched. Her colleagues noticed her increased nervousness. Dr. Wells, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in Sarah's obvious discomfort, though she had no idea of the real reason behind it. "You've been quite jumpy lately." "Miss Martinez," Dr. Wells commented during a staff meeting, "I hope the pressure of working in a prestigious hospital isn't getting to you." "I'm fine," Sarah replied. Her voice lacked conviction. The whispers about her tattoo had also intensified since the general's visit. Someone had started a rumor that she was pretending to be a veteran for attention, and the story had spread throughout the hospital like wildfire. Sarah found herself eating lunch alone more often, and even Dr. Chen had seemed to distance himself from her. On Friday afternoon, Sarah was restocking supplies in one of the emergency rooms when a young man in military fatigues was wheeled in on a stretcher. His leg was wrapped in bandages and his face was pale with pain. Sarah recognized him immediately as Lieutenant Morrison, the general's son. "I need the best trauma nurse you have," the medic who had brought him in announced to Dr. Wells. Dr. Wells looked around the room, and her eyes landed on Sarah. For a moment, Sarah thought she might assign someone else to the case, but professional duty won out over personal dislike. "Martinez," Dr. Wells called out. "You're with Lieutenant Morrison." Sarah approached the stretcher, her professional training overriding her personal fears. The young man's eyes were closed, but as she began checking his vital signs, he opened them and looked directly at her. "Are you the nurse my father mentioned?" he asked weakly. Sarah's hand froze on his wrist. "I'm not sure what you mean, Lieutenant." "He said there was a nurse here with an interesting background," Lieutenant Morrison continued, his voice growing stronger. "Said she had markings that told a story." Dr. Wells stepped closer, clearly intrigued by the conversation. "What kind of markings?" Lieutenant Morrison's eyes focused on Sarah's covered wrists. "The kind that show someone's been places they're not supposed to talk about." The room fell silent. Sarah could feel every pair of eyes in the emergency room focused on her. Her heart was racing, but she forced herself to continue her professional duties, checking the lieutenant's blood pressure and adjusting his IV. "I think you might be confused from the pain medication," Sarah said quietly. "No," Lieutenant Morrison replied with a slight smile. "My father has the same markings. He told me about a nurse who saved his life once in a place that officially doesn't exist. A nurse who earned the right to wear those symbols." Dr. Wells stepped forward aggressively. "What symbols? Show us what you're hiding under those sleeves." "That's not necessary," Sarah protested, but Dr. Wells had already reached for her arm. "I think it is necessary," Dr. Wells snapped. "We have a right to know if our staff are lying about their backgrounds." Before Dr. Wells could grab her sleeve, the emergency room doors burst open. General Morrison strode in, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the room. His eyes swept the scene, taking in his son on the stretcher and the tense confrontation between Sarah and Dr. Wells. "Is there a problem here?" the general asked in his authoritative voice. Dr. Wells straightened up immediately. "General Morrison, we were just discussing Miss Martinez's qualifications. Your son mentioned something about markings." "Did he?" the general replied, his tone giving nothing away. He moved to stand beside Sarah, his imposing figure creating a protective barrier between her and Dr. Wells. "And what conclusion did you reach?" "Well, we haven't seen any proof of her claims," Dr. Wells said, clearly flustered by the general's presence. General Morrison turned to look at Sarah, his eyes holding a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite read. "Miss Martinez," he said formally, "would you mind showing Dr. Wells your qualifications?" Sarah's hands trembled as she slowly rolled up her right sleeve, revealing the intricate tattoo that had caused her so much grief. The design seemed to come alive under the harsh hospital lighting, each symbol clear and precise. Dr. Wells leaned forward to examine the tattoo more closely. "I don't understand," she said. "It's just a bunch of random symbols." "Random?" General Morrison's voice carried a note of steel. He rolled up his own right sleeve, revealing an identical tattoo on his wrist. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs as people realized what they were seeing. These symbols, the general continued, his voice carrying throughout the emergency room, are awarded to members of an elite military medical unit, a unit that operates in the most dangerous locations on Earth, providing medical care to soldiers in classified operations. He turned to face the gathered crowd of medical staff. Each symbol represents a life saved under fire, a mission completed despite impossible odds and a level of courage that most people can't imagine. Dr. Wells's face had turned white. But she said she never served in the military. Because she was instructed never to discuss her service, General Morrison replied firmly. The missions we undertook were classified at the highest levels. The people who served in this unit were sworn to secrecy about their involvement. Lieutenant Morrison spoke up from his stretcher, his voice filled with pride. This is the woman who saved my father's life in Somalia. She carried him 3 miles through enemy territory with a bullet in her own shoulder. The emergency room had fallen completely silent. Sarah stood frozen, her tattoo exposed for everyone to see. As the truth of her past was finally revealed by the one man who had the authority to tell it. The silence in the emergency room stretched for what felt like hours, though it was probably only seconds. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she watched the faces around her process what General Morrison had just revealed. Dr. Wells looked like she might faint, her mouth opening and closing without any words coming out. Somalia? Dr. Chen whispered, breaking the silence. You were in Somalia? General Morrison nodded gravely. Operation Silent Mercy. Officially, it never happened. A joint task force was sent to evacuate American civilians from a medical facility that had been overrun by militants. Miss Martinez was part of the medical team. Sarah found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. General, you shouldn't. The classification period has expired, he interrupted gently. And I think these people deserve to know who they've been judging. He turned back to the crowd, his military bearing commanding absolute attention. The facility was under siege for 36 hours. We had wounded soldiers, civilians, and medical staff trapped in a building with no power, limited supplies, and enemy fighters on every side. Lieutenant Morrison shifted on his stretcher, wincing from the pain but determined to contribute to the story. Tell them about the explosion, Dad. General Morrison's jaw tightened slightly. A rocket-propelled grenade hit the building's main support beam. Part of the structure collapsed and several of us were trapped under debris. I had been hit by shrapnel and was bleeding heavily. Sarah closed her eyes, the memories flooding back despite her efforts to keep them buried. She could still smell the dust and smoke, still hear the screams of the wounded and the sound of gunfire echoing through the ruined building. Miss Martinez was also injured, the general continued. She had taken a bullet through her left shoulder trying to reach the wounded, but instead of seeking medical attention for herself, she organized the evacuation of the trapped personnel. Dr. Wells finally found her voice. But you're just a nurse, she said weakly. She was the highest-ranking medical officer still mobile, General Morrison corrected. And she made decisions that saved 15 lives that night. The general's eyes met Sarah's, and she saw something in them she hadn't expected, gratitude mixed with regret. She improvised surgical procedures with minimal equipment, managed our limited medical supplies, and kept wounded soldiers alive for hours while under enemy fire. The tattoo, Dr. Chen said, his voice filled with awe. What do the symbols mean? General Morrison looked at Sarah questioningly. When she nodded slightly, he continued. Each symbol represents a different aspect of her service. This one, he pointed to a particular design on her wrist, indicates medical personnel who have performed surgery under combat conditions. This one shows she completed the advanced combat medic training. And this one, he paused, his voice becoming quieter. This one is given to personnel who have carried wounded soldiers to safety while under direct enemy fire. The emergency room had become so quiet that Sarah could hear the hum of the ventilation system. Every person present was staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to admiration to shame. But why didn't you tell us? Asked one of the younger nurses. Sarah finally found the strength to speak. Because I couldn't, she said simply. The missions were classified. We were instructed to never discuss our involvement, even with family members. When I left the military, I was told to build a new life and never look back. But people have been treating you terribly, Dr. Chen protested. They've been calling you a fake, a wannabe soldier. It was better than the alternative, Sarah replied. Better than having people know about the things I've seen, the things I've had to do. General Morrison stepped closer to her. I'm sorry you've had to endure that, he said quietly. When I heard you were working here, I knew I had to come and see for myself. I never intended for your cover to be blown. Dr. Wells suddenly stepped forward, her face red with embarrassment. Miss Martinez, I owe you an enormous apology, we all do. The way we've treated you. You didn't know, Sarah said, though her voice carried a note of exhaustion. You couldn't have known. But we should have given you the benefit of the doubt, Dr. Wells insisted. We should have treated you with respect regardless of our assumptions about your tattoo. Lieutenant Morrison attempted to sit up on his stretcher, drawing attention back to his medical needs. Could we maybe finish this conversation after someone fixes my leg? He asked with a pained smile. The request broke the tension in the room and reminded everyone that they were in the middle of providing medical care. Sarah immediately refocused on her patient, her professional training taking over. You're right, Lieutenant, she said, checking his bandages. Let's get you taken care of. As Sarah worked, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues watching her with new understanding. The whispers that had followed her for months had been replaced by respectful silence and curious glances. General Morrison remained in the room, observing as Sarah efficiently managed his son's care. When she finished updating the lieutenant's chart, he approached her. Sergeant Martinez, he said quietly, using her former military rank for the first time in years. The title hit her like a physical blow, bringing back memories of the person she used to be. I'm not a sergeant anymore, General, she replied. No, he agreed. But you'll always be a soldier. And soldiers look out for each other. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an official-looking envelope. Your service record has been declassified. You're free to discuss your military experience if you choose to. You've earned the right to be proud of what you accomplished. Sarah took the envelope with shaking hands, feeling the weight of 5 years of forced silence finally lifting from her shoulders. Word of the revelation spread through Metropolitan General Hospital like wildfire. By the end of Sarah's shift, it seemed like every person in the building had heard some version of the story. Some details had been exaggerated in the telling, but the core truth remained. The quiet nurse they had been mocking was actually a decorated military hero. Sarah found herself in an uncomfortable position as people who had ignored her for months suddenly wanted to talk to her. Nurses who had whispered behind her back now approached with hesitant smiles and awkward attempts at conversation. Is it true you performed surgery during a battle? Asked Maria, one of the emergency room technicians who had been particularly vocal about the fake military tattoo. Sarah nodded simply. Emergency field surgery, yes. That's incredible, Maria breathed. I can't imagine having to operate while people were shooting at you. The attention made Sarah uncomfortable. She had spent years trying to blend into civilian life, and suddenly being thrust into the spotlight felt overwhelming. During her dinner break, she retreated to the hospital's roof access, seeking solitude under the evening sky. She wasn't alone for long. Dr. Chen found her there, sitting on a bench overlooking the city lights. Mind if I join you? He asked. Sarah gestured to the empty space beside her. I suppose word has gotten around by now. The entire hospital is talking about it, James confirmed as he sat down. But I wanted to talk to you about something else. Sarah looked at him questioningly. I've been thinking about how we treated you, he said, his voice heavy with regret. Not just Dr. Wells, but all of us. We saw something we didn't understand and immediately assumed the worst. We made you feel like an outsider. You were kind to me, Sarah protested. You sat with me at lunch when no one else would. But I still questioned the tattoo, James admitted. I was curious about it because I thought it might be some kind of fashion statement or rebellion against authority. I never imagined it represented actual military service. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the cars move through the streets below. I can't blame people for making assumptions. The tattoo is unusual and I couldn't explain it without breaking my oath of silence. But that's just it, James said earnestly. We should have given you the benefit of the doubt. You're an excellent nurse, you're professional, you're knowledgeable. Your work should have spoken for itself. Down in the hospital, General Morrison was having a similar conversation with Dr. Wells in her office. The head of the emergency department sat behind her desk, looking smaller than usual despite her authoritative position. I've made a terrible mistake, General, she said, her voice tight with shame. Miss Martinez is clearly an exceptional medical professional, and I let my personal biases cloud my judgment. General Morrison sat across from her, his expression serious but not unkind. Dr. Wells, may I ask what specifically bothered you about Miss Martinez's tattoo? Dr. Wells shifted uncomfortably. I suppose I felt like she was trying to claim military experience she hadn't earned. I've seen too many young people with military-style tattoos who have never served a day in uniform. It seemed disrespectful to real veterans. And yet you never asked her directly about her service, the general observed. No, Dr. Wells admitted. I made assumptions based on her age and appearance. I thought she was too young to have significant military experience. General Morrison leaned forward slightly. Dr. Wells, Sergeant Martinez enlisted when she was 18 years old. She completed advanced medical training, specialized combat medic certification, and served in 3 classified operations before she was 25. She has more battlefield medical experience than most military doctors twice her age. The weight of her prejudice hit Dr. Wells like a physical blow. I had no idea. Of course you didn't, the general replied. But that's exactly the point. You didn't know, yet you felt comfortable judging her. You created a hostile work environment based on assumptions. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Morrison was recovering in the VIP wing, where he had become something of a celebrity among the nursing staff. Unlike his father's serious demeanor, the young officer had inherited a more easygoing personality and was enjoying sharing stories about his famous nurse you should have seen. Her in action, he told a group of nurses who had gathered around his bed. My dad always said she was the toughest medic he ever worked with. She once set a broken leg while hanging upside down from a helicopter. Really? Gasped one of the nurses. Well, maybe not literally upside down, Lieutenant Morrison grinned. But the helicopter was definitely not landing. And she was definitely hanging out of it. Back on the roof, Sarah and James continued their conversation as the sun set over the city. Can I ask you something personal? James said carefully. Sarah nodded. Do you regret leaving the military? Sarah considered the question for a long time before answering. Sometimes, she said finally. The work we did was important. We saved lives in impossible situations, but the cost was high. I lost friends, saw things that still give me nightmares, and lived with constant stress for years. Is that why you became a civilian nurse?
I wanted to help people without the violence, Sarah explained.
I wanted to use my medical skills in an environment where the biggest danger was a difficult patient, not enemy gunfire. James was quiet for a moment, and instead you found yourself dealing with workplace harassment about your past. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. The irony wasn't lost on me. What happens now? James asked. Now that everyone knows the truth? Sarah looked down at her exposed tattoo, the symbols clearly visible in the fading light. For the first time in months, she wasn't trying to hide it. I suppose I figure out how to be myself again, she said. I've been hiding for so long, I'm not sure I remember who I really am. As they sat in comfortable silence, both of them knew that everything at Metropolitan General Hospital was about to change. The truth had a way of shifting the balance of power, and Sarah Martinez was about to discover that being revealed as a hero came with its own set of challenges. The following Monday brought changes that Sarah hadn't anticipated. When she arrived for her shift, she found a crowd of people waiting near the main entrance. At first, she thought there might be an emergency, but as she got closer, she realized the crowd was waiting for her. There she is, someone called out. And suddenly Sarah was surrounded by reporters, hospital staff, and curious onlookers. Camera flashes went off as people pushed forward, trying to get her attention. Miss Martinez, can you tell us about your military service? Is it true you saved a general's life in Somalia? What was it like being a woman in special operations? Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention. She pushed through the crowd as politely as possible, making her way to the hospital entrance where security guards helped clear a path for her. Inside, she found Dr. Wells waiting by the elevators, looking nervous and apologetic. Miss Martinez, Dr. Wells began, I want to speak with you privately. Could you come to my office before you start your shift? Sarah followed her to the administrative wing where Dr. Wells closed the door and gestured for her to sit down. First, I want to offer you a formal apology, Dr. Wells said, her voice sincere. My treatment of you has been completely unprofessional and unfair. I let my personal biases affect my judgment, and I created a hostile work environment. Sarah accepted the apology with a nod, but she could see there was more Dr. Wells wanted to say. I also want to offer you a promotion, Dr. Wells continued. The position of head trauma nurse just became available, and frankly, you're the most qualified person we have. Your military medical experience makes you perfect for the role. The offer took Sarah by surprise. Dr. Wells, I appreciate the gesture, but I don't want special treatment because of my military background. This isn't special treatment, Dr. Wells assured her. It's recognition of your qualifications. I should have seen your potential months ago, regardless of your military service. Meanwhile, General Morrison was dealing with his own complications. The revelation of Operation Silent Mercy had attracted attention from military brass, who weren't pleased that classified information had been disclosed, even if the operation was officially declassified. His phone rang as he sat in his temporary office at the hospital. General Morrison, came the stern voice of Admiral Richardson, his superior officer. I understand you've been discussing classified operations with civilian personnel. The operation was declassified last year, Admiral, General Morrison replied calmly. I had full authorization to discuss Sergeant Martinez's service record. Perhaps, but the timing is problematic. The media is having a field day with this story, and it's drawing unwanted attention to our special operations programs. General Morrison understood the concern, but he also felt a strong obligation to the woman who had saved his life. Admiral, Sergeant Martinez has endured months of harassment because she couldn't defend herself. She deserved to have her service recognized. I understand your loyalty, General, but we need to manage this situation carefully. Down in the emergency department, Sarah was trying to focus on her work despite the constant interruptions. Hospital staff members kept approaching her with questions about her military experience, and she could feel eyes on her wherever she went. Dr. Chen found her during lunch, sitting alone in the cafeteria as usual. How are you holding up? He asked, sitting across from her. It's strange, Sarah admitted. 3 days ago, people were avoiding me. Now they won't leave me alone. That must be difficult in a different way. Sarah nodded. I appreciate that people want to show respect for my service, but I didn't serve for recognition. I served because it was my job. Their conversation was interrupted by Maria, the technician who had been particularly critical of Sarah's tattoo. Miss Martinez, Maria said, approaching their table hesitantly. I wanted to apologize for the things I said about your tattoo. I feel terrible about it. Apology accepted, Sarah replied simply. I was wondering, Maria continued. My nephew is considering joining the military. Would you be willing to talk to him about your experience? Sarah looked uncomfortable. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that conversation. But you're a hero, Maria protested. Your story could inspire him. After Maria left, James looked at Sarah with understanding. You don't like being called a hero, do you? I was a soldier doing my job, Sarah said firmly. The real heroes are the ones who didn't make it home. That afternoon, Lieutenant Morrison was discharged from the hospital. As he was preparing to leave, he stopped by the emergency department to say goodbye to Sarah. I wanted to thank you again, he said, shaking her hand. Not just for the medical care, but for what you did for my father all those years ago. I was just doing my job, Sarah replied, echoing her earlier words to James. Lieutenant Morrison smiled. That's exactly what my dad said you would say. He handed her a small package. This is from him. He wanted you to have it. Sarah unwrapped the package carefully and found a military medal inside. It was the Silver Star, one of the highest decorations for valor in combat. Attached was a note in General Morrison's handwriting. This should have been yours 5 years ago. Better late than never. I can't accept this, Sarah said, trying to hand the medal back. My father anticipated you would say that too, Lieutenant Morrison replied with a grin. He told me to tell you that it's not a gift. It's recognition of service that was long overdue. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself thinking about Dr. Wells's job offer. The promotion would mean more responsibility, better pay, and professional recognition. But it would also mean more visibility, something she had spent years trying to avoid. During her break, she called her sister Elena, the only family member who knew about her military service. Sarah, Elena's voice was excited. I saw the news story online. I can't believe your secret is finally out. It's been overwhelming, Sarah admitted. People keep treating me differently now that they know. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Elena suggested. You've been hiding who you are for so long. Maybe it's time to embrace it. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Sarah, you saved lives. You're a hero whether you want to admit it or not. Maybe it's time to stop running from that part of yourself. That evening, as Sarah was finishing her shift, she received an unexpected visitor. General Morrison appeared in the emergency department, still in uniform but looking more relaxed than he had during his previous visits. Sergeant Martinez, he said formally, then smiled slightly. Or should I say soon-to-be head trauma nurse Martinez. Dr. Wells told you about the promotion offer? She did. She also asked for my recommendation, which I was happy to provide. They walked together toward the hospital exit, past the small group of reporters who were still hoping for another story. General, Sarah said as they reached the parking garage. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you ever regret Somalia? The operation, the secrecy, the way it changed our lives? General Morrison was quiet for a long moment. I regret the friends we lost, he said finally. I regret that good people like you had to carry the burden of silence for so long. But I don't regret the mission itself. We saved lives, Sarah. 15 people went home to their families because of what we did. Sometimes I wonder if it was worth it, Sarah confessed. Look around you, the general said, gesturing back toward the hospital. You're still saving lives. You never stopped being a soldier, Sarah. You just found a different battlefield. As Sarah drove home that night, she thought about his words. She had spent 5 years trying to separate her military identity from her civilian life. But maybe that had been a mistake. Maybe the skills and experience she had gained in the military weren't something to hide from, but something to build upon. She pulled into her apartment complex and sat in her car for a moment, looking at the silver star that Lieutenant Morrison had given her. For the first time since leaving the military, she felt a sense of pride in what she had accomplished. Tomorrow, she would give Dr. Wells her answer about the promotion. But tonight, she was finally ready to stop hiding from who she really was. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in the emergency department of Metropolitan General Hospital, watching her team respond to a multi-car accident with the precision and efficiency she had worked hard to instill in them. As head trauma nurse, she had transformed the department's emergency protocols, drawing on her military medical experience to improve patient outcomes and staff coordination. The transformation hadn't been easy. In the weeks following the revelation of her military service, Sarah had struggled with the sudden shift from being an outcast to being celebrated. Media attention had gradually died down, but not before several news outlets had run feature stories about the secret military hero working as a civilian nurse. Dr. Wells approached her as they finished treating the accident victims. Excellent work as always, she said with genuine respect. I still can't believe how much you've improved our response times. Sarah nodded her thanks, but her attention was focused on a young man sitting in the waiting area. He had been there for over an hour, nervous and fidgeting, clearly wanting to approach her but lacking the courage. Can I help you? Sarah finally asked, walking over to him. The young man looked up with relief. Are you Sarah Martinez? The nurse who served in Somalia? Sarah had learned to respond to these questions with patience rather than discomfort. I am. What can I do for you? My name is David Chen, the young man said, and Sarah realized he must be related to Dr. James Chen. I'm thinking about joining the military, but I wanted to talk to someone who's actually been there. Sarah sat down beside him. Over the past month, she had spoken with dozens of young people considering military service. She had learned to be honest about both the challenges and the rewards. What specifically do you want to know? She asked. Is it worth it? The sacrifice, the danger, being away from family? Sarah considered the question carefully. That depends on what you're looking for, she said. Military service isn't for everyone. It's demanding, sometimes dangerous, and it changes you in ways you can't predict. But it also gives you skills, experiences, and a sense of purpose that you can't get anywhere else. David listened intently as Sarah shared stories from her service, carefully avoiding classified details but giving him a realistic picture of military medical work. The most important thing, she concluded, is to be honest with yourself about why you want to serve. If you're looking for glory or excitement, you'll be disappointed. But if you want to make a difference and you're willing to work harder than you've ever worked before, it might be right for you. After David left, Dr. James Chen appeared at Sarah's side. "That was my nephew," he said with a smile. "Thank you for taking the time to talk with him." "He seems like a good kid," Sarah replied. "He'll make his own decision." James looked around the busy emergency department. "You know, this place is completely different than it was a year ago. Not just the procedures and protocols, but the whole atmosphere." Sarah followed his gaze. It was true. The department ran more smoothly now, and the staff worked together with a level of coordination that hadn't existed before. But more importantly, there was a sense of mutual respect among the team members that Sarah had worked hard to foster. "People are treating each other better," James continued. "I think what happened with you taught everyone a lesson about making assumptions." The lesson had indeed been powerful. Sarah's experience had prompted Dr. Wells to implement sensitivity training for all staff members, focusing on unconscious bias and the importance of treating colleagues with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. That evening, Sarah attended a hospital fundraising gala, an event she would have avoided in her previous life. She wore a formal dress that left her tattoo visible, no longer feeling the need to hide it. The symbols on her wrist had become a conversation starter, rather than a source of shame. General Morrison was also in attendance as the evening's keynote speaker. He had become something of a mentor to Sarah over the past months, helping her navigate the transition from hiding her military identity to embracing it. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general said during his speech, "I want to tell you about the true meaning of service. Service isn't about recognition or glory. It's about doing what needs to be done even when no one is watching." He looked directly at Sarah in the audience. "Some of the greatest heroes I've known have served in silence, their contributions known only to a few. But their impact ripples outward, touching lives in ways they may never fully understand." After the event, Sarah and General Morrison walked together through the hospital's memorial garden, a quiet space dedicated to healthcare workers who had lost their lives in service. "I have some news," the general said. "The Pentagon is considering declassifying Operation Silent Mercy entirely. They want to use it as a case study for joint military-civilian medical operations." Sarah nodded. "How do you feel about that?" "Proud," he said simply. "What we accomplished there saved lives and advanced military medical doctrine. It deserves to be remembered." They stopped in front of a bench dedicated to fallen healthcare workers. "Sarah," the general said, "I want you to know that revealing your service wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about showing people what real heroism looks like." "I'm still not comfortable with the hero label," Sarah admitted. "I know," the general replied with a slight smile. "That's exactly why you deserve it." As Sarah drove home that night, she reflected on how much her life had changed. She was no longer the isolated woman hiding from her past. She had become a leader, a mentor, and an advocate for others who had served their country. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. "Saw the news coverage of the gala. You looked radiant. Dad would be so proud." Sarah smiled, thinking of her father who had encouraged her to join the military all those years ago. He had passed away while she was still bound by secrecy about her service, never knowing the full extent of what his daughter had accomplished. The next morning, Sarah arrived at work to find a young woman waiting for her in the emergency department. She was wearing scrubs and had the nervous energy of someone starting a new job. "Are you Sarah Martinez?" the woman asked. "I am."
Can I help you?
"I'm Jessica Torres, the new trauma nurse. Dr. Wells assigned me to your team." Sarah noticed immediately that Jessica had a small tattoo on her forearm, partially hidden by her sleeve. Military symbols similar to but different from Sarah's own. "Army medic?" Sarah asked with understanding. Jessica's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you know?" "Takes one to know one," Sarah replied with a warm smile. "Welcome to the team, Jessica. I think you're going to fit in just fine here." As Sarah began showing Jessica around the department, she realized that her journey from outcast to leader had come full circle. She was no longer the person being judged for her tattoo, but the person creating an environment where others with similar backgrounds could feel welcome and valued. The symbols on her wrist caught the morning light as she gestured, each mark representing not just her past service, but her ongoing commitment to helping others heal. She had finally found a way to honor both the soldier she had been and the healer she had become.